Helen of Troy, Greek Hellene, in Greek legend, is the foremost lovely lady of Greece and the backhanded cause of the Trojan War. She was the girl of Zeus, either by Leda or by adversary, and sister of the Dioscuri. As a youthful young lady, she was carried off by Theseus, but she was protected by her brothers. She was moreover the sister of Clytemnestra, who hitched Agamemnon. Helen's suitors, including Odysseus, came from all parts of Greece, and from among them she chose Menelaus, Agamemnon's more youthful brother. Amid the non-appearance of Menelaus, be that as it may, Helen fled to Troy with Paris, child of the Trojan lord Priam, an act that eventually drove to the Trojan War. When Paris was killed, Helen hitched his brother Deiphobus, whom she deceived Menelaus once Troy was captured. Menelaus and Helen at that point returned to Sparta, where they lived joyfully until their passings. Agreeing to a variation of the story, Helen, in widowhood, was driven out by her stepsons and fled to Rhodes, where she was hanged by the Rhodian ruler Polyxo in exact retribution for the passing of her spouse, Lipolemus, in the Trojan War. The artist Stesichorus, in any case, related in his moment adaptation of her story that she and Paris were driven shorewards on the coast of Egypt where Helen was confined there by ruler Proteus. The Helen carried on to Troy was hence a ghost and the genuine one was recouped by her spouse from Egypt after the war. This form of the story was utilized by Euripides in his play Helen. Helen was revered and had a celebration at Therapne in Laconia. She moreover had a sanctuary at Rhodes, where she was adored as Dendritis, the tree goddess. Like her brothers, the Dioscuri, she was a benefactor divinity of mariners. Her title is pre-Hellenic and in faction may go back to the pre-Greek periods. Helen of Troy, in some cases called Helen of Sparta, may be a figure from Greek mythology whose elopement with, or kidnapping by, the Trojan ruler Paris started off the Trojan War. Helen was the spouse of Menelaus, the lord of Sparta, and was considered the foremost lovely lady in the world. Menelaus induced his brother Agamemnon, ruler of Mycenae, to create an extraordinary armed force to assault the powerful city of Troy in a range to recapture Helen. Taking after the Greek triumph in the war, Helen returns domestic with Menelaus but she becomes a detested figure within the antiquated world, an image of ethical disappointment and the risks of setting desire over reason. In spite of the destitute standing of the scholarly Helen, she moreover had a divine frame and was the center of religions at a few Greek destinations, outstandingly Rhodes, Sparta, and Therapne. Helen family relations. In Greek mythology, Helen was the girl of Zeus and Leda, the ruler of Sparta, and the spouse of Tyndareus. Zeus camouflaged himself as a swan to tempt Leda, and Helen was the result of their loving engagement. In another adaptation of the myth, Helen's mother is the goddess enemy, the embodiment of reprisal. Whoever is the mother, in both adaptations, Helen is born from an egg in Sparta. Helen's kin included the saint twins Castor and Pollux, aka Polydeuces, and Clytemnestra, the long-run spouse of ruler Agamemnon, the ruler of Mycenae. One day, Tyndareus advertised penances to all the divine beings but overlooked Aphrodite and the goddess, rankled at the slight, at that point guaranteed that all of the king's girls would end up scandalous for their infidelity. Helen had numerous celebrated suitors but she would wed Agamemnon's brother Menelaus, lord of Sparta. As a portion of the marriage bargain, Tyndareus yielded a horse and made all the Greek pioneers swear to perceive Helen as Menelaus' legitimate spouse and to secure his girl from hurt. This pledge would have genuine results when the time came for war. Menelaus and Helen had one girl, Hermione, and 3 children, Pleisthenes, Aethelas, and Meratheus. Helen was broadly considered the foremost excellent of all mortal ladies. In his Works and Days, Hesiod portrays her as fair-haired Helen, 165. Homer more than once depicts her in his works as Helen of the dazzling hair, white-armed Helen and ruler among ladies. Homer moreover portrays her as derisive Helen. The judgment of Troy, Prince Paris. For the Greeks, the roots of the Trojan War went back to one specific occasion. At the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, Eris, the goddess of conflict, advertised a brilliant apple to the foremost lovely of the goddesses of Olympia. Zeus welcomed the nice-looking Trojan ruler Paris, also called Alexandros, to be the judge and choose between 3 choices: Athena, Hera, or Aphrodite. Prince Paris advertised actuations from all 3 candidates. Athena guaranteed him quality, excellence, and invulnerability in the fight. Hera advertised the districts of Asia and gigantic riches, and Aphrodite advertised the foremost wonderful lady in the world, Helen. Prince Paris chose Aphrodite, and he was able to seize his prize when he went on a conciliatory mission for the Trojans and got to be a visitor within the house of Menelaus. The combine fell in a door and stole away to Troy, aka Ilium, so that Helen of Sparta presently got to be Helen of Troy. Helen, in spite of the fact that she deserted her children, and was went with by her loyal worker Aethra. On the way domestic, Paris halted in Sidon in Phoenicia and stole an accumulation of treasure, which he took back to Troy. The 5th century BCE Greek student of history Herodotus tells a diverse form of these occasions in his history. Here Herodotus claims that Egyptians had told him by and by that Paris and Helen had met unfavorable winds and so had cruised for Egypt, not Troy. On landing, Paris men surrendered the eloping couple and upbraided them to the nearby ministry. They did this since Paris had stolen Helen when he was a visitor at the domestic of Menelaus, an illicit and profane act in Greek culture. In courage, Paris had taken with him a load of austere loot. Proteus, the ruler of Memphis, is educated, and he captures Paris and keeps both the plunder and Helen to allow back to the Greeks at a few future dates. Herodotus even states that other journalists like Homer, see underneath, knew this adaptation but chose a more epic and engaging story including the city of Troy and a long war. Be that as it may, there's common ground in both adaptations since Herodotus goes on to say that the Greek armada in the interest of Helen made contact with the Egyptians but essentially did not accept she had not been taken to Troy and so they attacked that city. When they found out she had been in Egypt all the time, Menelaus sailed to Memphis and got his spouse back. In expansion to all of these subtle elements, Herodotus claims that a sanctuary devoted to a foreign Aphrodite at Memphis was, in truth, built in honor of Helen. Anything the points of interest of how or on the off chance that Helen ever ought to Troy, whether she went of her own free will or was abducted could be a difficult question to resolve. That Helen was a willing darling of Paris is seen in age-old loft earthenware scenes, but in others, Paris gets her arm, and not her hand. However, other earthenware scenes appear Menelaus brandishing a sword as he recovers Helen, recommending she is unwilling to return to her husband. At that point once more, elective scenes appear Menelaus drops his sword, apparently in pardon, when he meets Helen once more. Anything the equivocalness in craftsmanship and writing, in a recognizable negative demeanor toward ladies extending from Pandora to Medea, most Greeks considered Helen improper. As the history specialist Barbara Graziosi notes, no one within the antiquated world thought that it was all right for a real-life lady to act like Helen. Indeed, on the off chance that Aphrodite, goddess of adore, Ares, god of war, and Paris were all considered as much to fault as anybody for the awful results of the Trojan War. The Trojan War. The most important source for our information of the Trojan War and the foremost well-known adaptation of the story is displayed by Homer in his Iliad, an epic sonnet composed at some point within the 8th century BCE, and which was based on more seasoned verbal legends. Concurring to this form, a gigantic armed force of numerous Greek states cruised for Troy and laid attack on the city until Helen was recovered. The Greeks envisioned this war to have happened at some point within the 13th century BCE, what we nowadays would call the Aegean Bronze Age. A struggle between Mycenaeans and Hittites may possibly have happened, and archaeologists are for the most part understanding that the incredible city with noteworthy cautious dividers which has been unearthed in modern-day Turkey is without a doubt Troy. The city has many layers of history, and what archaeologists call Troy 6, which dates to circa 1750 to 1300 BCE, is respected as the foremost likely candidate for Homer and Helen's Troy. A war over exchange, assets, and colonies appears very likely, in spite of the fact that not on the scale of the epic Trojan War. Indeed, in mythology, Agamemnon is propelled to lead the Greek armed force not only to spare his brother's honor but to procure immense riches. Concurring with the story, the Trojan War kept going a long time and took put within the city of Troy in Anatolia. Troy had gigantic dividers, and so the war was generally an attack with a few breaks for open fighting on the field's exterior of the city. Priam, the lord of Troy, and his child Hector, both treat Helen deferentially amid the strife, with Hector, in particular, accusing Paris as the bringer of war. In this period, Paris and Helen had 4 children, 3 sons, Eunomus, Agonis, and Idaeus, and 1 girl, Helen. All 3 boys will pass on when a roof collapses in the chaos at the conclusion of the war. One of the numerous important scenes of the war is when Menelaus fights Paris in a one-on-one fight, with the victor guaranteeing Helen. Menelaus gets the superior of the Trojan ruler, but he is spared by Aphrodite and whisked from the war zone back to the security of his chambers. The Greeks, at last, win the strife through the ploy of the Trojan horse, a massive wooden symbol interior of which were covered up Greek warriors who get the interior of the city and open the doors for the rest of the Greek army to take after. The Trojans were either all butchered or oppressed, a brutal update within the myth of the indiscretion of infidelity. Paris is murdered by a bolt and let go by Philoctetes. Menelaus, in the interim, is rejoined with Helen. Agreeing to a few forms of the story, the austere king first draws his sword and is serious about striking down Helen sometime recently, seeing her bare breasts, having reconsider, and after that grasping her. In one Greek play, Menelaus is depicted as a rather dim chap who is present as it was concerned his spouse had not put on any weight during the long attack. Anything the adaptation could be a case of forgive and forget. Helen the return home. Menelaus and Helen return to Greece, ceasing off at different places along the way. These occasions are told by Homer, this time in his journey. To begin with, the couple is dashed against the rocks of Crete in a storm. Another, arriving in Egypt, the couple spends a long time there. Incapable to pick up favorable winds to urge domestic, Menelaus makes trips to Cyprus and after that the city of Sidon in Phoenicia, an arrival of fine materials and flatware, a few of which the Spartans get as trinkets. Another is North Africa, Libya, which is depicted as a bountiful arrival, and after that a trip to Ethiopia as Menelaus' treasure trove develops. Homer too has Menelaus meet Proteus in Egypt, who is here not a ruler but the ocean god better known as the Old Man of the Sea. These Mediterranean makeshift routes, and those of Paris on his return voyage to Troy, would be a legendary clarification for the Bronze Age exchange between Mycenaean Greece, Phoenicia, and Egypt, clarifying, as well, the transferal of thoughts in craftsmanship and earthenware. Helen and Menelaus at long last get favorable winds and make it back to Sparta. They rejoin with their girl Hermione, who weds Orestes, the child of Agamemnon. This clarifies how a single lord came to run the show in both Mycenae and Sparta. The cult of Helen. Or maybe it chances with her standing in Greek writing, Helen was revered as divine at certain Greek destinations. Researchers broadly assert that Helen must, to begin with, have been a goddess and after that a semi-divine human figure. It may be that the myths of her kidnappings were a clarification for the goddess' transitory non-attendances from her faction destinations. Rhodes and Attica had factions to Helen. It was at Sparta, in any case, that she was most well known as a devout adolescent, as an image of the move from youthful to the bride, Parthenos to Nymphe. Helen moreover spoke to the grown-up hitched lady, Gyne, and the figure of a sister, Adelphi. At Rhodes, Helen was related to richness, trees, and vegetation, whereas at Sparta she spoke to the angles of suggestive crave and magnificence which Aphrodite essentially spoke to. One of the most seasoned havens devoted to Helen was at Therapon, close to Sparta. There she spoke to the grown-up hitched lady, and the location had a sanctuary where offerings were made in Helen's title so that she would give appealing qualities on the reliable. Herodotus records in his Histories, 6.61, that the third spouse of ruler Ariston has marvelously changed from a state of extraordinary offensiveness to a raving excellence, much obliged to the divine intercession of Helen at Therapon. According to the 2nd century CE Greek history specialist and geographer Pausanias in his depiction of Greece, local people accepted that Menelaus and Helen were buried at Therapon. Their tomb was built in 700 BCE and closed a 15th century BCE Mycenaean palace and comprised of an expansive rectangle of ashlar pieces with a little sanctuary, all set on a hill and drawn closer by a slope. Unearthings have uncovered the location, gotten dedicatory offerings to the match, and was in utilize until the 1st century BCE. Helen in art and literature. Helen and the Trojan War were exceptionally well-known subjects in numerous other cases of classical writing other than Homer. For illustration, she is highlighted in Aeschylus' Agamemnon and Virgil's Aeneid. Within the 5th century BCE tragedian Euripides' Trojan Ladies, Helen shows up in a trial sometime recently that captured ladies of Troy and guards her behavior. Helen's chief defense against the charge of infidelity is that she had ended up a toy of the divine beings and so might not dodge her destiny. In Differentiate, in Euripides' play Helen, the ruler never comes to Troy but, as in Herodotus' form, she remains all the whereas in Egypt. The pedant Gorgias, c. 485, c. 380 BCE, displayed a funny defense of Helen, but this was most likely an exercise in talk instead of any attempt to set the verifiable record straight. Within the visual expressions, Helen developing from an egg shows up on red figure earthenware from Apulia and Campania in the 4th century BCE. Helen snatching by Theseus shows up on the upper room red figure earthenware of the bygone period. She regularly shows up in both red figure and black figure earthenware scenes of the classical period, being driven absent by Paris, in residential scenes, and being sought after by or accommodated with Menelaus. Right through Relic and for centuries after, the story of Helen proceeded to captivate, particularly in the Renaissance period when she shows up in a wide run of sorts from the depictions of Tintoretto, 1518 to 1594 century, to the lyrics of Christopher Marlowe, 1564 to 1593 century. It was Marlowe who penned the lines by which Helen is most recollected nowadays.